The storm was merciless, a wall of white swallowing the mountains whole. Somewhere out there, two American soldiers clung to life, their radios fading into static. 6 hours, that's all the time they had before the cold claimed them. Inside the Tactical Operations Center, maps glowed, officers argued, and then silence. Every aircraft in the arsenal was blind-grounded, powerless. The weight of inevitability pressed on every chest. Echo 5 was alone. And yet in that silence, one figure moved. Claire Whitaker, the woman they mocked as the Duchess, reached for her harness. Her eyes did not flinch from the storm on the screen. Her voice cut through the despair like steel through ice. "If someone has to fly," she said, steady and unyielding, "I will." But how could a woman once branded by failure possibly take the skies and dare the impossible? At Sage Bluff Air Force Base, dawn broke not with beauty, but with duty. The desert sun spilled gold over hangars and flight lines, painting long shadows across rows of steel. The ground trembled with the distant growl of engines warming for sorties. For the men of the 87th Squadron, this was another day in the life of warriors. For Claire Whitaker, it was another day of being judged. They called her the Duchess. At first, it was a nickname delivered with chuckles, because her posture was too perfect, her boots too polished, her tone too precise. She saluted like she was born to it, spoke like she'd memorized the manual, and carried herself with the quiet pride of someone who refused to slouch even when no one was watching. To the others, it wasn't charm, it was distance. To them, she was the outsider in their brotherhood of dust and grease. Claire Stone Whitaker was unlike the men she served beside. She was younger than some, older than others, yet carried an air that didn't fit into their banter. Her beauty was undeniable, striking gray-blue eyes that seemed to weigh everything in silence. Sun-gold hair braided tight beneath her flight cap, the athletic lines of a woman honed by discipline. On her back, etched into pale skin, was a soaring eagle, wings spread wide, its talons clutching nothing but air. Most never saw it, but those who did whispered, "She wears her creed on her skin." Behind that strength lay a scar invisible to all but her. TG Weir Weight 111. The numbers haunted her like a metronome. They weren't random. They were engraved on a steel dog tag that never left her locker. TG, her brother Thomas Grant. Year 111, the day he perished in an Alaskan snowstorm during a training exercise. Claire had been 17 then, old enough to understand the cruelty of loss, but too young to carry the weight. He had been her protector, the one who whispered that she could be more than just little sis. The storm had silenced his voice forever, leaving her with a single vow: she would fly, and she would never again let the storm win. But vows don't erase prejudice. Around the ready room, whispers carried like smoke. "She's too by the book. She won't last one rotation. Women don't belong in hogs. Leave the warthogs to men who know bar fights, not ballroom dances." The words were rarely cruel to her face, but they hung heavy in the air. Claire met them with stone silence. Her jaw squared, her hands steady. Every morning she pressed the eagle on her shoulder blade, a silent ritual, and whispered to herself, "Steady hands." On the flight line, though, Claire revealed a different side. She treated the ground crew not as faceless mechanics, but as comrades. She knelt beside them, learning the smell of hydraulic fluid. The rhythm of a torque wrenched, the subtle hum that told a jet's heart was sound. When one young crewman stumbled, spilling a toolbox, she was the first to kneel, helping gather scattered wrenches. "Every bolt matters," she said quietly, "because one bolt can save a pilot." Those words lingered long after she walked away. Respect wasn't given in the squadron, but the ground crew began to offer her nods, handshakes, even smiles. Seeds of trust had been sown. Her aircraft was the A-10 Thunderbolt II, known as the Warthog. It was not elegant, not sleek, not the kind of plane you'd see on recruiting posters. But Claire studied it as if it were scripture. She explained to the young mechanics, and sometimes to herself, why the jet mattered. Close air support, she'd begin. CAS means flying low and slow beneath the radar, where the enemy sees your eyes before they feel your fire. The A-10 is armor wrapped around a gun, the GAU-8 Avenger. The cockpit is a bathtub of titanium. If we get hit, it's not about ejecting. It's about surviving. The Hog takes the bullets, so the soldiers on the ground don't. She knew the men laughed at her lessons, calling them textbook sermons, but she also knew the truth. Pilots came and went. Aircraft burned out. Yet somewhere in some canyon or ridge, a squad of soldiers would live another day because the Warthog absorbed the fire meant for them. And she, outsider Duchess Stoneface Claire, intended to be that shield. Still, when night came and the hangars quieted, the silence pressed on her heart. Alone in her quarters, she'd sit with her brother's dog tag in her palm. TG A-10 Warthog. The memory of his last words before deployment whispered like a ghost. "Don't let the cold take you, sis. Keep your hands steady." She clenched the tag so hard her fingers left marks. A woman whose hands once trembled in blinding white. Could she ever redeem herself? The crackle of the radio cut through the calm of the ready room. A young controller's voice trembled as he read the message Echo 5 is pinned. Granite spine. Storms rolling in. They've got 6 hours of warmth, maybe less. Every head lifted. Granite spine, the name alone carried weight. A wall of jagged rock where winds tore metal apart, where radar failed, where even drones turned useless shadows. On the monitors, the storm cell bloomed in angry red, spreading like ink across the digital map. Drones vanished in static. Satellites blinked out. The Air Force, with all its machines, was suddenly blind. Men shifted uncomfortably in their chairs. Jokes died on their lips. The squadron that laughed the loudest now sat silent, each pilot measuring the risk in his own mind and quietly deciding someone else would take it. Claire stood in the corner, eyes locked on the storm. To others, it was a blur of data, but to her, it was memory. She remembered another storm, another loss, her brother's voice swallowed by white silence. Her stomach knotted, but her eyes narrowed, focused not on the fear, but on the terrain etched beneath the weather cell. There it was, the Thistle Ravine. A narrow cut through the mountains, twisting like a scar invisible to satellites, but burned into her memory from training flights. It was the only path low enough, sheltered enough to sneak beneath the storm's deck. Treacherous, yes. Nearly suicidal, yes. But possible. She pressed her hand against the eagle on her back, feeling the ink through her flight suit. Her brother's voice echoed. Steady hands. Granite spine may be blind, she whispered to herself. But I've seen the ground with my own eyes. Her gaze lifted to the men around her. They shifted, avoided her eyes, some smirking, some doubting. She knew what they were thinking. She was the Duchess, disciplined, rigid, a foreigner in their rough fraternity. Who would believe her? Who would follow her? But when the room froze in indecision, Claire did not. She stepped toward the map, her voice calm, deliberate, undeniable. There's a way, she said, through the Thistle Ravine, under the storm. The silence deepened, heavier than before. One of the men scoffed, shaking his head. Another muttered, "She's crazy." But Claire's eyes didn't waver. She wasn't pleading, wasn't begging to be believed. She was offering a truth born of scars. And in that moment, a question hung over the room like the storm outside. Who would believe a duchess? The briefing room was heavy with the smell of coffee gone cold, the storm's red swirl still pulsing on the screen. Claire stood tall, her words about the Thistle Ravine still hanging in the air like smoke after a shot fired. But instead of respect, the room erupted in chuckles. Hammer the veteran leaned back in his chair, boots planted, wide arms folded. His face was carved by years of sun and steel, and his voice carried the weight of someone who thought he had seen it all. "Don't bring theory to the battlefield," he said, his tone sharp as shrapnel. "That ravine's not a tactic, it's a tomb. You'll put steel in the ground before you even clear the first bend." The words hit her harder than she expected. For a heartbeat, she was no longer Claire Whitaker, officer of the U.S. Air Force. She was a 17-year-old girl again, staring at a folded flag, hearing the chaplain say "frozen to death" in the Alaskan range. She could almost feel the cold creeping into her brother's hands the way he never came back. The silence in the room turned suffocating. Someone coughed. Another tapped a pen. None spoke in her defense. The weight of their doubt pressed down a chorus of unspoken agreement. The Duchess doesn't belong in the storm. Then came the proposal, slid across the table by logistics like a verdict, ground all flights for 24 hours. Wait the storm out. Preserve the squadron. Preserve the assets. Claire's throat tightened. Assets. Not lives, not Echo 5 freezing on Granite Spine with 6 hours left. Assets. The debate sparked. Some pilots nodded better to lose 2 soldiers than a $40 million plane and its pilot. Others kept their heads down, unwilling to risk their place by speaking up. The storm on the map pulsed steadily like a heart that didn't care for human arguments. Claire's hands curled into fists. She could feel the burn of the dog tag against her skin. TG 081 her brother's silent witness. 6 hours left, that's all. And yet part of her faltered. The weight of failure still echoed in her bones from the last time she hesitated in the simulator. Could she truly risk her life, risk becoming another folded flag on nothing but her conviction? For a moment she considered silence. For a moment she nearly stepped back into the shadows, letting the storm swallow Echo 5 just as it had swallowed her brother. And then like gravel grinding under boots, another voice cut the air. Old steady, carrying both command and memory. Colonel Gravel, the squadron commander, stood from the back of the room. His hands bore scars from an age before drones and digital maps, his eyes sharp despite the years. He didn't speak to the whole room. He spoke only to her. "If you believe the ravine is real, Lieutenant," he said slowly, "draw it. By hand. Show me the way your eyes see it." The laughter died. The chatter ceased. Every eye turned to Claire. Her pulse pounded in her ears. This was not theory now. This was the test of memory, of courage, of steady hands. She nearly backed out until the old commander laid a map in front of her. The map lay on the table, its creases worn from years of folded use. Every contour line, every ridge and hollow stretched out like a battlefield frozen in ink. For a long moment, Claire didn't move. Her hand hovered over the paper fingers, tight around the pen. She could feel eyes on her, their skepticism, their smirks. Then she drew a slow breath and whispered to herself, "Steady hands." The pen touched the map. At first, the line wavered. A chuckle came from the back of the room. But Claire didn't flinch. She traced the ravine from memory, each turn, each narrow stretch, each sharp bend, where the mountains rose like jagged teeth. The line wasn't pretty, but it was precise. When she lifted the pen, silence filled the room. Colonel Gravel leaned over his scarred finger, following her path. His weathered face gave nothing away, but after a moment he gave a short nod. "If you can hand-draw the route," he said, voice gravelly as his name, "then maybe you can fly it." The weight of those words shifted the air. For the first time, someone hadn't dismissed her. But belief from one man didn't silence the room. Hammer scoffed, leaning forward. "Hand-drawn lines don't keep you alive at 300 knots in zero visibility." He jabbed a finger at the map. "That's still suicide." Before Claire could answer, another voice broke in, not mocking, not harsh, but curious. It was Lieutenant Cody Maple Wallace, the youngest pilot in the squadron, known more for his obsession with avionics than for combat bravado. He stepped closer, holding a tablet under his arm. "Sir," he said, carefully addressing Gravel, "I've been reviewing the last batch of flight tapes. There's something worth seeing." He tapped the screen and telemetry filled the display, altitude graphs, roll rates, sensor arcs. Lines of data that most in the room ignored as background noise. Maple's finger traced one anomaly. Here, during a hard bank, the targeting pod gimbal loses line of sight for 3.8 seconds. If an enemy team had a modern, shoulder-fired system positioned just right, those seconds would be enough. The room stirred uneasily. 3.8 seconds. It sounded small, insignificant. But to anyone who had ever faced fire from the ground, it meant life or death. Claire's eyes flicked to Maple, surprised. He wasn't mocking her. He was proving her point. She stepped closer, pointing to the same line. "That's exactly what I meant. The ravine forces the enemy into predictable positions. If we ignore this window, we're flying blind." For the first time, a conversation began instead of an argument. Some pilots leaned in, studying the screen. Others frowned, unwilling to admit the Duchess might have seen what they missed. Gravel stayed silent, letting the moment breathe. Maple closed the tablet and looked at Claire, his young face lit with the quiet spark of respect. "I think she's right," he said simply. The words didn't win her the room, but they cracked the wall that had shut her out. For the first time since stepping into Sage Bluff, Claire wasn't standing entirely alone. She caught Gravel's gaze, steady as the mountains themselves. In his eyes, she saw no pity, no favoritism, only the weight of a commander who had watched too many young pilots prove themselves in blood. His nod was small, but it was enough. Claire's pulse steadied. She had an ally. perhaps even a mentor. But as she walked back to her seat, a darker thought whispered at the edges of her mind. Would this fragile belief save her from the next failure? Or would the storm demand more than even steady hands could give? The simulator bay was cold, lit by sterile fluorescent lights that hummed faintly overhead. Claire lowered herself into the mock cockpit, the harness clicking shut across her chest. For a brief moment, the familiar scent of rubber seals and electrical ozone wrapped around her like armor. This was supposed to be her domain aircraft instruments numbers. Here no storm could touch her. The canopy hissed closed, plunging her into a world of glowing screens and projected landscapes. A canyon bloomed in high resolution, jagged and unforgiving. Voices crackled in her headset. Hog 2, this is Ranger 2. We're pinned down. Heavy fire from the ridge. Technical truck east. We need air support now. Her training surged forward, precise and sharp. Hands steady on the throttle, eyes sweeping the displays. She slaved the targeting pod to the coordinates, zooming in on a grainy image. Shapes moved among the rocks. Her pulse quickened. Target locked. Maverick away. The missile streaked across the canyon, a streak of white fire. A bloom of explosion lit her screen, shaking her seat with simulated recoil. The JTAC's voice cut in frantic, "Good hit, Hog 2, but you're taking fire." Brake warning tones screamed in her headset. Claire yanked back the stick, climbing hard. Her instincts screamed speed, altitude superiority, the lessons of the typhoon. The Warthog responded sluggishly, and the canyon walls blurred past. Her teeth clenched. Back around for the infantry. She banked, low eyes darting across the terrain. Figures moved below, tiny and distinct. Shadows against stone. She hesitated, then squeezed the trigger. The cannon thundered the aircraft, rattling with savage vibration. Dust and smoke rose. The enemy suppressed, or so she thought. Then in blood-red letters across her display, "Mission failed. Blue-on-blue incident. Friendly casualties." The canyon vanished, replaced by sterile black. The sudden silence was deafening. Claire's breath caught in her throat, her hands frozen on the controls. Friendly fire. She'd killed her own. The canopy opened with a hiss, revealing the harsh, fluorescent light once more. Gravel stood at the console, arms folded, face unreadable. He didn't shout. He didn't curse. His voice was low, steady, and merciless. "Guardian angels," he said, "need to smell the cordite." Claire blinked, confused. He stepped closer, eyes locked on hers. "You trusted a screen. Dust, smoke, shadows, they lie. Down in the dirt, you don't fly by pixels. You fly by eyes, by the smell of fire, by the soldiers' smoke on the ground. Guardian angels don't hover at 8,000 feet. They bleed with the men they protect." His words hit harder than any explosion. She unclipped her harness, climbing out with legs that felt unsteady. She wanted to argue, to defend herself, but the truth was carved into the screen, glowing in red. Her precision had been flawless. Her instincts had been deadly. She had failed. In the debrief room, Gravel replayed her flight. Line by line, numbers scrolled across the screen. Altitude 8,000 feet. Airspeed 450 knots. Too high. Too fast. You turned a hog into a typhoon, Lieutenant. That's not a fighter's job. These aren't coordinates. These are men. Claire swallowed hard, forcing herself to stand straighter. Her voice came quiet but unflinching. "The responsibility is mine. I misidentified the target. I'll relearn from scratch on your terms." Gravel studied her for a long moment. Then he gave a small nod, almost imperceptible. Respect wasn't won here. It was demanded, earned in failure, burned into her skin like cordite. As she left the room, the weight of her brother's dog tag pressed against her chest. She whispered to herself the vow she had made long ago, steady hands. But another voice followed, close behind, cold and merciless. "Can trembling hands stay steady when it truly matters?" The desert dawn at Sage Bluff came not with beauty, but with work. While the squadron still slept, Claire was already on the tarmac. Her breath misted in the cool air, her gloved hands brushing against the cold titanium skin of the A-10. To others, it was just a machine, ugly and loud. To her, it had become a teacher, stern, unyielding, and relentless. Her first test came at the range. The GAU-8 Avenger cannon waited, its 7 barrels gleaming in the morning light. Claire lined up the sight, pulled the trigger, and the world exploded. The roar wasn't just sound. It was a physical assault, a shockwave that slammed into her chest and rattled her teeth. The recoil dragged the entire aircraft backward, slowing it in midair. At first, she fought against it, jerking the stick to steady the craft. But slowly she understood, you don't fight the hog's gun, you fly the whole airplane into the shot. Her corrections grew smoother, her passes steadier. When she landed, the ground crew's eyes carried something new, not mockery, but respect. The second test was colder, harsher. In the simulator, she faced icing conditions. The HUD blurred as frost spread across the canopy. Warning tones screamed. The hog shuddered, wings heavy with invisible weight. Gravel's voice came over the headset. "Hold her steady. VREF plus 15. Watch your angle of attack." Claire fought the instinct to climb to outrun the danger. Instead, she kept the hog's nose low airspeed fast enough to cheat the ice, but not so fast she lost control. Her hands ached from the tension, but this time she didn't panic. The lesson was carved into her in ice survival is patience. The third trial was the hardest. Crosswind landings. The desert gusts turned the runway into a shifting, treacherous line. Each approach felt like threading a needle in a hurricane. Claire forced the hog into a crab nose, angled into the wind, the whole plane sliding sideways toward the tarmac. At the last second, she kicked the rudder, straightening the hog tires, screaming against concrete. Too hard. She tried again, and again. Sweat ran down her back, but she refused to yield. On the 10th attempt, the hog touched down smooth brakes, pulsing in rhythm. It wasn't luck, it was mastery earned through bruised pride and stubborn resolve. Through it all, allies began to gather round her. Maple was the first, the young pilot with eyes for data. He lingered after training, asking questions no one else dared about gimbal limits, about sensor masking, about the blind spots everyone ignored. Together they pored over flight tapes, watching frame by frame where the targeting pod lost sight. 3.8 seconds, that window haunted them both. "That's not theory," Maple whispered one night. "That's a kill zone." For the first time, Claire felt she wasn't the only one fighting shadows. The ground crew, too, began to shift. They had seen her at dawn, hands dirty, sweat soaking her collar. One morning, as she stepped onto the line, the crew chief handed her a folded cloth. Stitched in uneven letters were two words, "Steady hands." She held it in silence, throat tight. It wasn't applause. It wasn't a medal. It was trust, the kind that mattered more than rank. But enemies didn't vanish. Hammer remained a storm in human form. He dismissed her data, scoffing at telemetry. "Screens lie," he barked. "Out there, it's mud smoke chaos. I once had a man-pads lock so close I saw the plume before my flares even kicked. Data would have killed me. Instinct saved me." His story sent a shiver through the room. Every pilot knew the terror of a missile streaking upward, hungry and unstoppable. Yet his words cut deeper. They weren't just about combat. They were about her. To Hammer, Claire's reliance on numbers made her dangerous. The tension simmered. Some pilots nodded to Hammer's scars. Others leaned toward Maple's quiet proof. The squadron split the air thick with unspoken lines. Claire stood between them, carrying both burden and bridge. She knew Hammer wasn't entirely wrong. Dust, smoke, and chaos did lie. But she also knew that ignoring data was gambling with lives. And so night after night, she wrestled with the contradiction. In her journal, she wrote, "The hog demands instinct, but instinct sharpened by truth, not blinded by pride. Can data save lives, or will it kill them?" Her tests had only begun. The GAU-8 had rattled her bones. The ice had numbed her resolve. The wind had nearly thrown her from the sky. But the true trial wasn't in the air. It was here among her own, winning the respect of those who still doubted her, and proving that steady hands could hold both instinct and intellect in balance. The Nevada Canyon spread out beneath them, like a labyrinth carved by giants. Two A-10s swept low through the valleys, their engines thundering against stone walls. Claire flew wingman, her hog tucked neatly behind Hammer's lead. It was supposed to be routine, another live-fire exercise, but Claire's eyes weren't on the targets. They were on the telemetry scrolling across her display numbers she had studied night after night with Maple. The ravine ahead was shallow, the roll angle steep. The mask window was coming. "Lead, you're rolling into the dead zone," she called, her voice sharp. "TGP will lose lock for 3.8 seconds on your bank, possible shoulder fire exposure." Hammer's laugh crackled back over the radio, low and dismissive. Duchess, I've been flying hogs since you were polishing your cadet shoes. Don't bring me math problems when I'm dancing with death. But the words had barely left his mouth when a shrill warning tone cut the airlock on. Hammer's hog jolted as the missile alert screamed. He yanked hard flares, spitting from his belly. A plume of smoke cut across the sky, rising from the canyon's shadow. The missile missed barely. For one frozen heartbeat, Claire could see it. Hammer's hog wreathed in firelight, his voice sharp, now stripped of swagger. Fox threat. That was close, too close. When they landed, his anger was volcanic. He ripped off his helmet, eyes blazing. You think numbers saved me up there? No luck did. Don't you dare act like you were right. He slammed his gloves onto the table, his voice echoing off the hangar walls. From now on, Duchess, you're grounded from the hot seat. You'll watch, take notes, leave the fighting to warriors. The squadron heard every word. Claire stood rigid, her face unreadable, but inside her chest, shame burned like acid. She had been right yet punished as if she had failed. The weight of doubt returned heavier than before. That night, alone in her quarters, she laid her brother's dog tag on the table. TG 0811 gleamed under the lamp, an unyielding reminder of how storms swallowed the unprepared. Her fingers trembled as she picked up her pen, ready to write, ready to confess defeat. Maybe Hammer was right. Maybe she didn't belong in the hog. Maybe her place was silence. The door opened. Colonel Gravel stood there, cap under his arm, his voice quiet but firm. Lieutenant, I've seen too many hands tremble before battle. Some never steadied. Some found their rhythm. But one thing I know, steady hands don't leave the seat empty. He set the cap down, his gaze steady on hers. You can walk away, Duchess, or you can be ready when the seat calls you back. Then he left no lecture, no order, just a truth laid bare. Claire sat motionless, Gravel's words echoing in the silence. The shame still burned. The doubt still whispered. But beneath them both, something older, harder, steadier stirred. She would still enter the fight, only harsher than she ever imagined. The storm arrived like a living beast. One moment the granite spine was jagged rock under a pale winter sun. The next a wall of gray swallowed it whole. Snow blasted sideways, erasing valleys, ridges, and sky. Wind howled across the tactical operations center's comms, filling every frequency with static. On the screens, icons vanished one by one. Drones, satellites, radar. The U.S. Air Force blind. Echo 5 has gone dark, the comm officer announced, voice tight. Thermal sensors last pinged them 90 minutes ago. Survival window, 6 hours at best. A heavy silence gripped the room. The colonel rubbed a hand down his face, his eyes fixed on the storm cell pulsing red across the map. Every pilot present knew the truth. No aircraft could navigate that chaos. Not a drone, not a fighter, not a bomber. The sky had closed its doors. Claire stood in the back shoulders, square face pale under the fluorescent light. Her brother's dog tag pressed against her chest like ice. 6 hours. Tomaren. The same number he hadn't survived years ago in Alaska. She felt the echo of cold fingers slipping from her grasp, a voice swallowed by snow. She couldn't let it happen again. She stepped forward, her voice calm but unwavering. There is a way in. The Thistle Ravine runs under the storm deck. If I fly it visually, I can reach Granite Spine. Heads turned. Disbelief rippled across the room. Hammer scoffed openly. That's suicide. No radar, no GPS, nothing but whiteout and granite. You'll auger in before you see the target. The colonel's jaw tightened. He didn't disagree. But Gravel's gravelly voice broke the silence. Condition 1, aircraft 1 pilot. No formation, no distractions. And I'll be your sole controller. My voice in your ear, nothing else. Claire met his eyes. Understood. Minutes later, the hog roared to life on the runway. Snow lashed the canopy, the storm shrieking like it wanted to rip the plane from the earth. Claire tightened her harness-gloved hands, gripping the stick. Steady hands, she whispered. The hog strained against the gale tires, thundering across icy concrete. For a moment it seemed the storm might win, but then with a lurch, the A-10 lifted, clawing its way into the maelstrom. Immediately the world vanished. The windshield became a wall of gray snow hissing across the glass. Claire forced the nose down, descending below the storm deck. At 500 feet, the ground reappeared, a terrifying rush of snow-draped cliffs and black pines. The ravine opened ahead, narrow and twisting its walls, rising like jaws ready to snap shut. Gravel's voice was calm in her headset. Follow the river, Duchess. Stay inside the bend. Trust the contours. Airspeed 150. Angle of attack steady. Her instruments screamed. Ice built on the leading edges of her wings. Pitot heat alarms flashed. The hog groaned as turbulence tossed it like a toy. Claire adjusted trim, nudged throttle, fighting the urge to climb. Stay low, she whispered. Stay steady. Every second was a battle. She feathered the stick against the storm's fists, countering gusts that threatened to roll her into the canyon walls. Her muscles burned, sweat soaking beneath her flight suit, though the cockpit was freezing. A burst of static ripped across the comms. Then a voice, faint, broken: ambush, multiple hostiles West Ridge. The channel died in a wash of white noise. Claire's heart slammed. Enemy contact or a ghost of radio interference? She strained her eyes against the snow. For a breathless instant, she thought she saw movement on the ridge, dark shapes, muzzle flashes. She armed her cannon thumb on the trigger, then paused. The ridge erupted, but not with fire. A sheet of ice, loosened by wind, collapsed in an avalanche, boulders crashing against rock. No ambush, just nature's fury. She exhaled, hard heart hammering. False intel could kill as easily as bullets. Gravel's voice anchored her. Eyes forward. Don't chase ghosts. Stay on the ravine. She pressed on. Every bend brought new threats. Updrafts that shoved her skyward, downdrafts that tried to slam her into the river. Ice clawed at her wings, the hog shuddering with each gust. Warnings blinked like Christmas lights, yet her hands remained steady, her voice calm. Ahead, the ravine widened into a bowl. Echo 5's last coordinates were here, but through the blizzard she saw nothing, just snow rock emptiness. Her headset crackled. Echo 5, if you hear me, pop smoke. Silence. Then faint, so faint she thought she imagined it, a cough of red smoke against the white. But the enemy could be near. If she strafed too close, she could kill the very men she came to save. She thought of her brother, his last day in the snow. That day I prayed someone was in the sky. Her jaw tightened. I won't fail them. She rolled into a shallow dive, lining the reticle, not on the smoke, but 50 meters in front. Her thumb pressed the trigger. The GAU-8 roared. 30-millimeter shells tore across the slope, ripping rock and snow in a line of fire. The canyon walls magnified the sound into a hellish thunder, echoing like the wrath of heaven itself. Snow exploded upward in a blinding wave, cascading down in avalanches. The message was clear. You are not safe. Run. Show of force complete, Claire reported, voice steady. On the ridge, shadows scattered. Enemy silhouettes, once bold, broke and fled, diving for cover. Inside, the TOC cheers erupted as Echo 5's voice crackled through the static. This is Echo 5. We're alive. Whoever's up there, you saved us. The room erupted, but Claire had no time to celebrate. Ice gnawed at her wings, the hog, heavy, sluggish. Her body trembled with exhaustion. The countdown still ticked on the talk screens, 5 hours of survival left. But the storm was far from over. Her hands gripped the stick knuckles white. Will hands that once trembled in white hold steady to the end, she whispered almost to herself. Gravel's voice was the only reply. Calm, solid, unshakable. Bring them home, Duchess. Bring yourself home. And into the storm she flew again, brother's voice in her heart, the eagle on her back burning like fire. The talk was a furnace of tension until the broken transmission crackled alive. This is Echo 5 alive. I repeat, alive. Snowblind, but we're holding. Whoever's up there, you saved us. The room erupted. Chairs scraped hands, slapped backs. Voices rose in disbelief and joy. Months of rigid military discipline shattered in that instant. Men and women shouted, laughed, even wept. A colonel who hadn't smiled in years closed his eyes and whispered, "Thank God." Claire didn't hear the celebration. She was still in the storm, the hog trembling beneath her wings, sheathed in ice. Her body ached from the fight, but her voice was steady as she checked in. Mission complete. Returning base. When she broke through the final clouds, the base lights glowed faint in the blizzard. The hog groaned onto the runway tires, screeching against the frozen surface. She slowed, taxied, and cut the engines. Silence fell broken only by the howl of the storm. Then she saw them. The entire squadron, dozens of pilots and crew, stood in formation along the flight line. No hangar shelter, no excuses. They were out in the storm snow, plastering their uniforms, wind cutting across their faces. They didn't cheer. They didn't shout. They saluted in silence the way warriors salute one who has crossed death's threshold and returned. Claire opened her canopy. The cold slashed at her skin, but her chest burned hot. She climbed down, boots crunching into snow, and for the first time in years she felt the weight of belonging. Among the line of frozen faces stood Hammer. His jaw was tight, his eyes unreadable. He didn't move, didn't speak, only watched. Claire met his gaze for a fleeting second. No salute, no words. Just silence heavier than the storm itself. The victory was real. Echo 5 was alive. The squadron saluted. Yet a question gnawed at her heart. Was this victory truly recognized? Or was it still a battle half won? The snow swirled harder, wrapping the moment in a veil of white. Claire's hands curled into fists, steady now, not trembling. Whatever recognition came or didn't, her truth had already been written in the sky. The storm had thinned, but inside Claire's cockpit, the battle wasn't over. As she taxied clear of the runway lights, a sharp amber glow lit her console, HYD press low. A second later, another warning chimed, both systems leaking. Her stomach clenched. Without hydraulics, the Hog's controls would harden into iron. She had minutes, maybe seconds, before they froze entirely. "Control, this is Hog 2, she called, voice tight but steady. "Hydraulic failure. Reverting manual." In the talk, silence fell. Everyone knew what that meant. Manual reversion was the Hog's brutal safety net, steel cables and pulleys, instead of hydraulics, raw muscle instead of assist. Few had lived to talk about it. Claire pulled the override. The stick turned heavy, sluggish, every correction, like dragging a plow through wet clay. The Hog no longer responded with grace. It lumbered, groaned, resisted. She gritted her teeth, trimmed furiously, every motion, small measured. Overcorrect once and she would flip into the ground. Her breathing slowed. Steady hands. She lined up with the runway again. Winds still gusted, snow swirling across the lights. She lowered the gear, half expected nothing, but the Hog groaned and complied. Brakes she knew would be faint shadows of themselves. Airspeed 150. Glide path, steady. Gravel's calm voice filled her ear. "Trust the Hog. Trust yourself." Claire held the nose. The stick fought her cables, straining her forearms, screaming with effort. At 100 feet, the plane bucked sideways, a crosswind slamming into its flank. She fought the urge to overcorrect, nudge trim, whispered through gritted teeth. "Steady, steady." The wheels slammed the runway hard. The Hog skidded, veering left. Claire stomped the rudder, coaxed the beast straight, pumping the emergency brakes in rhythm. The runway blurred past, lights streaking in the snow. Finally, the Hog groaned to a stop, steam hissing from overheated brakes. Claire slumped against the harness, chest heaving. Her hands, though trembling from fatigue, had never once betrayed her. Outside, emergency trucks fanned around the Hog, lights strobing red and blue through the storm. She opened the canopy, the cold slicing her face, and climbed down onto the frozen tarmac. Hammer was waiting. For once, the fire in his eyes was gone. He walked up slowly, boots crunching on snow helmet tucked under one arm. For a moment, the storm filled the silence between them. Then he extended his hand. "I owe you," he said simply. Claire looked at it, then met his gaze. No sarcasm, no dismissal. Just truth. She took his hand firm and steady. Around them, the squadron gathered in the snow, their faces lit by the runway lights. They had seen the storm, the landing, the impossible flight. Respect didn't need words, it was etched into the way they looked at her now. But as Claire pulled off her glove to wipe the frost from her wrist, the real secret glimmered through the snow. Ink black and sharp etched into her skin, TG 0811. The dog tag had always carried it, but here it was carved into her flesh. Her brother's date, his coordinates, the reminder of the storm that took him. It wasn't just a mark of loss. It was a vow that no one else would be left alone in the white. Her hands closed over the tattoo, steady now. The Hog had tried to break her. The storm had tried to bury her. Even her own squadron had doubted her. But she had returned. And as the blizzard howled, one thought cut through the cold: the fight wasn't finished. The storm had only shown her who she truly was. The storm had passed, but in the ready room the air was still heavy, as if the snow itself had seeped into the walls. Claire sat quietly, flight suit unzipped, the sting of exhaustion in every muscle. Around her the squadron buzzed with low voices. For the first time their glances weren't mocking, they were searching, almost reverent. Hammer leaned against the wall, arms crossed. He hadn't spoken since their handshake, but now his eyes dropped to her wrist, where her glove no longer hid the black ink etched into her skin. TG or 8 weapon. What is that? He asked, his voice softer than anyone had ever heard it. The room quieted. Claire looked down at the tattoo, traced the numbers with her thumb. Her voice came low, steady, carrying across the silence. It's the date and coordinates of the storm that took my brother. Training exercise in Alaska. His unit was cut off. They lasted 6 hours. Nobody reached them in time. Her eyes lifted, gray-blue and unflinching. I carry it here to remind me no soldier dies forgotten in the snow. Not if I can stop it. No one moved. The storm outside rattled against the windows, but inside the weight of her words pressed into every heart. For the first time, the Duchess was no nickname. It was a title carried with solemn pride. Then Gravel stepped forward, holding a tablet under his arm. He set it down on the table, calling up flight telemetry. Red lines traced across a map showing the very window Claire had warned about, the 3.8 seconds where targeting pods lost their line of sight during a standard roll. Her numbers were right, Gravel said, his gravelly tone cutting through the quiet. Hammer nearly paid the price. Luck saved him. It won't save the next one. Hammer's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. Gravel tapped the screen. Effective immediately, the Razorback Squadron will revise SOP. No more blind rolls through masked terrain. We adapt or we bury pilots. The announcement hit harder than any cheer. It wasn't just validation, it was transformation. Claire hadn't only saved Echo 5, she had shifted the doctrine of a hardened unit. She had changed the way they would fight and survive from this day forward. For a long moment, the squadron sat in silence. Then Maple, the young pilot who had believed her from the start, let out a breath. About time we stopped flying blind. A murmur of agreement spread. Even Hammer, after a pause, gave the smallest nod. Claire sat back, the weight of it sinking in. She had flown through the storm, yes. She had kept Echo 5 alive. But now the ink on her wrist, the vow to her brother, had become more than personal. It had become policy. A legacy written not in scars alone, but in the lives of every pilot who would never again be caught in that kill zone. And yet, as the squadron dispersed, she lingered at the table, staring at the map, the tattoo, the storm fading beyond the glass. A question lingered like the echo of thunder. But what legacy will she truly leave behind? Would it be just a flight into the white? Or would it be a torch passed to those who came after, a reminder that steady hands, even scarred ones, can change the fate of many? The storm broke at dawn. The Nevada desert lay hushed beneath a blanket of white, the horizon glowing faintly with rose and gold. On the far side of the airfield, a transport rolled to a stop outside the field hospital. Two figures stepped down, bandaged, shivering eyes hollow from their ordeal. Echo 5. Their bodies were weak, but their arms still strong enough to hold the families who rushed forward. A wife's sob cut through the morning air, a child clung to her father's neck, and a mother pressed her face against her son's chest, refusing to let go. Soldiers often came home to silence. Today, Echo 5 came home to love. From a distance, Claire watched. She didn't intrude. Her heart swelled at the sight, but she knew this embrace belonged to them. She had done her part. She had kept the promise etched on her wrist. Later that day, she walked into the squadron's ready room. The walls bore patches, photographs, and mementos left by generations of pilots. She paused before the bulletin board where notes of thanks and fragments of history were pinned. In her hand, she carried the small cloth the ground crew had stitched for her steady hands. Without ceremony, she pressed a thumbtack into the corner and pinned it among the others. The cloth hung plain and quiet, yet it glowed with meaning. A gift from those who worked in shadows. A symbol that strength was not in loud words, but in the trust that others placed in your hands. She stood for a long moment, then nodded once and walked away. That night, in the solitude of her quarters, Claire wrote a letter. Not to her own family, not to her commander. To a mother she had never met, the mother of one of the Echo 5 soldiers she had pulled from the storm. Her handwriting was deliberate, each word etched with the weight of what had been risked. Ma'am, you don't know me. I was the pilot on duty during the Granite Spine storm. Your son is alive. He's alive because he never gave up, because he kept faith that someone would come. I only answered that faith. I want you to know he was never alone. Not for a single second. Respectfully, Lieutenant Claire Whitaker. She folded it neatly, slid it into an envelope, and set it by the door for morning post. Days later, she found herself back in the cockpit of her hog. The canopy gleamed with melted frost, the desert sun warming its skin once more. She rested her hands on the controls, the same hands that had once trembled in the blinding white, that had once faltered under shame. They were steady now, calm, unshaken. The hog hummed beneath her like a trusted companion. The storm had tested them both, and both had endured. Her reflection in the glass was not just a pilot. It was a promise that mistakes could be learned, from that weakness could be tempered into strength. Her brother's dog tag glinted against her chest, TG-08111, no longer only a scar of loss, but a bridge to every life saved. And in that moment she understood. A strong system is not one that never fails. It is one that learns, adapts, and gives second chances to machines, to squadrons, and to people. Especially to people. The desert wind whispered across the canopy as the hog rumbled to life its engines, singing a steady, patient hymn. If you've ever known steady hands that brought someone home, a father, a comrade, a friend, write their name in the comments below. Let their legacy live here among us. Because sometimes the bravest thing a pilot, or any of us, can do is to steady our hands long enough to guide another safely back to where they belong.